Hello everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to make a motion graphic effect like this one in Adobe After Effects. So jumping right in, here on the left is our project window. Here is where we can find all of the different assets that we are working with when we are working in After Effects. But right now we don't have any assets currently imported. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in my folder here, and I'm just going to drag in some footage and drag in an icon that I'll be working with later. And that's it. That's how you import assets into After Effects. Easy as that. If I want to sort them into folders, I can go down here, click the little folder icon, give this a name like footage, and just drag my footage into there. So now that I've imported my assets, I want to create a new composition. And a composition is basically think of it as a workbench for all of your clips and images and everything that goes into your shot. The composition also defines what is the resolution of your video and what's the frame rate and other settings like that. So one way to make a new composition is to drag my footage into the time slider, and just like that, it creates a composition in my project window. When I make a composition this way, it will retain the resolution and frame rate from the clip that I used. However, if I want to make a fresh composition with no default settings, I can go up here to Composition, New Composition. And from here, I can start by giving my composition a name. And I can set my resolution and my frame rate and duration this way. And I can hit OK. And it just gives a blank composition. And then from there, I can drag my footage back in again. Now, because I want my composition's frame rate and aspect ratio to match up perfectly with the footage I've selected, I'm just going to go with the method where I drag the footage into the time slider and create a composition that way. And then I can right-click on my composition and select Composition Settings to give it a new name. Down at the bottom of our screen, we have the time slider, which allows us to grab this blue handle here and scrub through our footage back and forth. We could also press the spacebar to play our footage. Press it again to pause. And then if I want to go back and forth frame by frame, I can press page up and page down. You can also zoom in and out of your timeline with this little slider right here. You can see the entire timeline spread out like this. Or if you need to zoom in on a particular part, you can slide the slider back in like that. Or you can grab these handles to manually adjust the length of your timeline view. Next to the time slider are our layers. And these work very much like Photoshop layers, where they stack up on top of each other and overlap each other from top to bottom. So to give an example of how this works, I'm going to duplicate my footage with Control D. You can see now I've got two layers. And then with my selection tool, which can be accessed with the V key, I'm going to drag my top layer footage over to the side and hit play. You can see that both layers are playing together, but one is on top of the other. I'll undo that because I don't need two layers of that. You can also trim your footage. So if you click and drag the edge of your layer in the time slider, you can shorten the footage like so, either from the back or from the front. I'm just going to offset these a bit so you can see how this works. So I'm going to hit play, which plays, cuts early, and starts up again from the beginning. It's important to note that when you trim your footage, it's not deleted. You can see this area where it's just lightly shaded. That's where I've trimmed a bit off of the beginning of the clip. And if I drag the side of the clip back, the footage is restored. If I want to save a little bit of time, I can use keyboard shortcuts to trim from the left and right sides. So if I hold Alt and press left bracket, it'll trim the left side to the time slider. Move our time slider over here, and hold Alt and right bracket. It will trim my footage to my time slider on the right. So now we know how to trim, let's talk a little bit more about these buttons over here next to the layers. So I'm going to overlap the footage again to show off a couple things. So first of all, on the very far left, we have this eyeball, which turns on and off the visibility of a given layer. Next to that, we have the mute icon. Now, if this video had sound, then we would have the option to tick a box to mute or unmute the video, but there is no sound, so there's nothing I can do with it. Next to that is the solo button, which lets me isolate a layer, so it hides all the layers that are not that isolated layer. And then there's the lock, which prevents me from making any changes to this layer, which can be really nice to prevent you from making mistakes by working on the wrong layer accidentally. Back over here on the right, just above the time slider, is the work area, which essentially defines our workspace. So if I were to hit play, the video will stop and restart when it hits this point. Now, let's say I wanted to trim my composition to the length of this work area. Well, the long way I could do it is I could take my time slider, drag it to the end, and look at the time here, and take note that it is at 4 seconds and 16 frames. And then I can go back to my composition settings and input that time manually. So say 16 frames, hit OK, and trim my composition that way. Or, hitting undo a couple times, what I could do is I could simply right click my work area and select trim composition to work area. And it effectively works the same way. Next, let's look at the preview window, which I'm sure you've noticed up here. It shows you exactly what we're going to see in our composition once this is rendered out. And down below, we have a couple options relating to the preview window. First up, we have the magnification ratio, which lets us change how zoomed in our preview is. So I can select different ratios and get it smaller or larger. Also, if you use the scroll wheel on your mouse, you can switch between these levels of magnification. You could also set it to fit up to 100%, and that will cause your preview to match your window size, no matter how you scale it. Next to that, we can define the resolution of our preview. So by default, it's set to full, which is just going to be the maximum resolution, but you can also set it to half or down to a quarter. You can see that the resolution gets really, really chunky. This is to compensate for less powerful machines. In case running the preview at full resolution is slowing down your machine, you can set it to a lower resolution. Next to that, we have fast preview options, which allow us to turn on a adaptive resolution mode, which basically means while that's on and you are running on a slower machine, and if you scrub through your timeline, it will display everything in a lower resolution and then upscale it if you stop in one place and it has time to process that frame. Now coming back down to the layers section again, let's talk about layer properties. So if I click this little arrow, open that one, I can see all the transform data for this layer, and I can make changes to it. So from the bottom up to the top, we have opacity, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just how opaque the layer is. If I click and drag any of these values, I can change them that way, or I can click and then manually type in a value. Next, we have the rotation, which lets me rotate my footage. Then we have the scale, which is how big or small the image is. By default, the vertical and horizontal scale stay in proportion to each other, but I can turn that off by clicking this little chain, and then I can just scale on the horizontal or the vertical axes. Then we have the position, which will change where my footage is located in the frame. This is the same as using the selection tool to move my footage around. And then we have the anchor point, which is this little symbol in the middle here. The anchor point is essentially like the pivot point for my layer. So if I want to move my pivot point, I can go up here to select my anchor point tool, which I could also access with the Y key. And then I can move this, say, over there. And now any sort of transformations I do, such as scale or rotation, they will happen from that anchor point instead. So now it's scaling in proportion to the anchor point, and same with rotation. If I want to move my anchor point back to the center, I can go to Layer, Transform, and go down to Center Anchor Point in Layer Context. And now my anchor point is restored. Another way to return your anchor point to the center of your layer is to press Alt, Control, and Home together. It'll pop that anchor point right to the center. Also, if you say move your layer way off to the side and you want to move it back to the center, you can press Control Home to pop the whole layer back to the center. Next, let's talk about keyframes. Keyframes are little markers that you can place in your time slider, which allow you to change certain values such as your scale or rotation or your position over time. In other words, we are beginning to animate now in After Effects. So any of these parameters with a stopwatch next to it can have keyframes set for it. So for example, I'm going to move my time slider to the start and I'm going to click the stopwatch for my position, and it adds a keyframe to my time slider at the very beginning. And I'm going to slide down to 1 second. And if I want to add another keyframe, I don't want to click the stopwatch again because that will remove my keyframes. So I'm going to undo that. Instead, I'm going to click this button here to add another keyframe. So now I've got 2 keyframes, which basically save the values of my position at each of these points in the time slider. From that point, I'm going to go to my last keyframe. And I'm just going to use my selection tool. And I'm going to drag this down. I'm going to hold Shift to make sure that it goes in a straight line down. So it's just out of frame. And if I drag my time slider back, you can see that After Effects is interpolating the motion between the 2 points. And if I hit play, my frame moves down. If I'm not happy with where a keyframe is at, I can click and drag it to a different spot on the time slider. So now the motion will be a lot faster if I move them closer together. Or I could even reverse the positions. And now I've reversed the animation. This works with other parameters, of course. So, for example, I'm going to hit Scale. I'm going to add a keyframe to right about here. And I'm going to drag my scale down by a lot. So now, as the animation plays, it will start small and it will grow to a large size. Hit play. And voila. Now, if I click the stopwatch to get rid of my keyframes, the parameter will default to wherever my time slider is at the moment. So because I got rid of the keyframes at this point, the position is now stuck at this sort of midway point. So I'm going to undo that. And delete the position. So I'm going to move these scale keyframes so that they take place over the first second of the clip. Like so. And press play. And that motion is pretty unnatural. It's a pretty linear transformation from 40 to 100. And that doesn't look very good. Luckily, we can go in and further edit this interpolation so that it eases in and out of the animation. To do that, I'm going to highlight both of my keyframes and I hit F9. And you can see it changed the shape of these keyframes a little bit to these hourglass shapes. And now if I hit play with the spacebar, it eases in and out of that animation. If I want to take this a little bit further, I can, with one of these keyframes selected, select the graph editor. And now you can see the animation between the 2 keyframes laid out as a graph. So on this graph, we can see the scale goes from low to high, 40 to 100. And then going horizontally, we can see how the animation now goes smoothly up from 40 to 100. So now if we play with these handles, we can adjust the curve even further. So for example, if I grab this handle and hold shift, just drag it out like this, you can see that it starts out really slow and ramps up. Or if I move it the other way, put the ramp right in the middle here, you can see it has a much different effect. I could even move this curve so it overshoots a little bit. You can see that it actually overshoots and then scales back down. So a lot of different things you can do with these curves to make your animations just a little bit more interesting. Once you're done in the graph editor, you can click this button again to go back to your time slider. Now I don't actually want this footage to move anywhere, so I'm going to go ahead and click this stopwatch to remove my scale animation. Before we go any further with this, let's talk about saving your file. So to do that, go up to File, click Save As, and give your file a name. And hit Save. And what that'll do is it'll make this .aep file, which stands for After Effects Project. And that's basically your equivalent of, say, like your Photoshop document or other similar working file. Now that I've saved, I want to move on to talk about shapes. To do that, I'm going to hide my footage layer for now. And now up here in our toolbars, there is this rectangle here. I'm going to click that, and that is our shape tool. So with that activated, I can click and drag anywhere in my frame, and it will make a shape. I'm not just limited to rectangles though. If I Control Z that, I can click and hold the rectangle button, and there's actually a couple different tools here. So there's a rounded rectangle tool, an ellipse tool, a polygon tool, and a star tool. I'm going to work at the rounded rectangle tool. Over here to the right, there are a couple different parameters you can set for your shape. So for example, the fill color, you can set your fill to something besides just red. Okay. Then there's the stroke color, which is basically the outline for your shape. And then next to that is a number followed by px. This is the pixel width of your outline. I'm going to turn that way up. And then if I create a shape, it fills in with those new colors. Also, if I come in and click the word fill rather than the color box, it'll give me different options. I could have no fill or a solid color, or there's options for linear and radial gradient. So for example, here is a radial gradient. Click OK. And now when I click this, it gives me options for colors on the outside and the inside of this shape. So if I click this box here on the left, I can select a color to go there. I'm going to copy this value, which is basically the code for this color in particular. I'm going to click this button on the right to select the inner color, paste in my hex code there, and I'm just going to turn up the lightness. So it's a gradient from dark to light, and then I'm going to hit OK. And same thing over here with stroke. I'm going to go ahead and just turn off the stroke now. So it is just the fill color. And if I make my shape, I've got my gradient. If I wanted to bring that stroke color back after I've made the shape, I could always go up here and change those options from there as well. Same with the gradient. Say I wanted a dark outside, I could move the positions of these two colors in the slider here. Okay. I think I'll turn off the stroke for now. And then down here in your layers, you can see that this actually has created a new layer just for our shape. If I go down under Contents, Rectangle, and open that up, there's a whole lot of options we can work with here. So for example, we can select Rectangle Path and say I don't like that those corners aren't very rounded. I could always turn up the roundness. Bring it to about there. You could also adjust the size vertically and horizontally. Let's say I want these to be the same size on vertically and horizontally. I'll just put in 500. And hit the chain to keep that aspect ratio. Again, if I want to move something to the center of my frame, I can hit V and select it with my selection tool, and then hit Control-Alt-Home to move the anchor point to the center, and then Control-Home to move it to the center of the frame. Moving down, I can also change the values of my gradient. So if I want to change the size of the center of my gradient, I can scale the endpoint. Now I think it's about time to add that little letter image that I imported earlier. So I'm going to grab my mail icon, and I'm just going to drag it to my time slider just above the shape layer. Make sure it lines up. It's pretty big, so I'm just going to click one of these handles and hold Shift to scale it down to about there. And later I'm going to be moving this shape around, and I want the mail icon to move around with it. So to do that, I'm going to have to work with parenting. And parenting works like this. Basically, any of the transformations that happen to a parent layer will be passed along to any of the child layers. So to make my shape layer the parent of the mail icon, I'm going to go over here, click where it says None under Parent and Link, and I'm going to select Shape Layer. And now, if I move my shape, the letter icon moves with it. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a second rectangle. So with my shape layer selected, I can click and drag, and it'll add another rectangle to that same layer. And these rectangles can even be rearranged like they're their own layers. They'll all be contained within the one single layer. I could also deselect that layer by just clicking outside of it, and then click and drag to make a whole new shape layer. And as you can see, by making it as a new layer, it goes over the letter layer. However, I'm going to keep things tidy by having everything on just one layer. So I'm going to have my shape layer selected, and then I am going to click and drag in a new shape. And then with that second rectangle selected, let me make sure it's selected with my selection tool, and go over here to Fill, change the colors. Delete on these midpoints. And grab this handle to tighten up the gradient. Bring it in. Actually, I think I will just make this a solid color red. Then I'm going to go down into rectangle 2, just the rectangle path. I'm going to go ahead and type in 50 by 50. Well, that's a little small, but I'm going to click one of these handles, hold Shift to scale it back up to about there. And then what I want to do is I want to increase the size of this just on the horizontal plane in animation. So I'm going to go to about second 2. I'm going to hit the stopwatch for size. And I'm going to go to, let's say, second 5. And I'm going to hit this to make another keyframe. And then I'm going to change the size like this, make it nice and long. And because I want those to be smooth, I'm going to select both of those keyframes and hit F9. Next up, I want to add some text to this. So I'm going to go over here. 2 icons down from the shape tool is the horizontal type tool. And it works very much like Photoshop. You click it, and then you click anywhere in your scene, and you can start typing text, like hello. And for this, I want to just have a bunch of numbers to imply there's a lot of emails to check. So then once I've typed my text, I can click outside of it and drag to move it to where I want. And then I can double click the text. It's hard to tell that it's highlighted because of the red background behind it, but if I move it outside, you can see that it's being highlighted. I'll move it back, give it a highlight. And there's a couple things I can do with this. I can go over here, and here we have different menus to help us out. I'm going to open up the paragraph menu. And right now my text is aligned to the center, but I could align it to the left or to the right. And then under that is the character menu. And that lets me change things like the size of the text or the height. I think I'll make it a little bit taller. Change the width. Whether it's bold or italicized, or I can change the font. There's a lot of different fonts to choose from, but I'm going to stick with Arial just to keep things simple. I'll scale up the text a little bit more. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and animate the opacity on these 9s. So I'm going to go to about here. Up the 9 layer. Make a keyframe for opacity there. And one a little bit further down here. Return to my first keyframe. I can sort through my keyframes with these little arrows next to the keyframe icon. And my earliest one, I'm going to hit 0. Enter. And now that will animate in. And just like before, I'm going to select both of those keyframes and hit F9 to add an ease in, ease out. So let's see how that looks from the beginning. There we go. My red shape here without animating the blue shape. So I'm actually going to have to extract this rectangle from the shape layer I have currently. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and go up to Layer, New, Shape Layer to give myself a new shape layer. And I'm just going to drag it by the name and bring it back down to just above the first shape layer. I'm going to open this up. And then under the contents of the first shape layer, I'm going to find my rectangle 2. And I move my time slider to the position where this scaling animation starts. And I'm going to hold Control and press X to cut that rectangle from the shape layer. And then up in the new shape layer, I'm going to select Contents and I'm going to press Control V to paste that into the contents of the new shape layer. Now, I did paste it in the wrong spot, but that's okay because I can just match it up with the text I had before. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and name these. So this is the red shape. This would be blue shape. Just so that I can differentiate the two easily. And I'm going to go ahead and parent the red shape to the blue shape. Move it up just above the mail icon. And then the 9s, I'm going to go ahead and parent to my red shape. Great, so now when I move my red shape, the text follows. With the blue shape, all of it moves together. I'm going to add a opacity animation to the beginning of this. I'll click there. Down that way. Another frame. Opacity 0. So my icon fades in, scales up, and the text arrives. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of rotation to the end to add a little more flair. So I'm going to come to about here. I'm going to add a rotation keyframe. And I'm just going to go down 6 frames. Add a keyframe. Add another one. Another one. There. And what I'm going to do is on every other one of these frames in the middle here, I'm going to hold shift and select each of them. Drag my time slider to the first one. And I'm just going to alter the rotation slightly. Maybe like 6. I'm going to go to this keyframe, select that one, select this one. I'm going to type in -6. So now it goes back and forth before going back to a resting state. And I'm going to select all of them, hit F9. And it looks all right. And one more piece of animation, I'm going to go ahead and animate the whole thing rising up out of nothingness. So I'm going to keyframe the position. Then I'm going to move down a little bit on the time slider, make another keyframe, and just move it down. All right. I'm going to hit F9 to add the ease in, ease out. I'm going to go to my graph editor, and let's adjust this a bit. Now, I may be in the graph editor, but for whatever reason, it's not giving me any handles to adjust the curves in the graph. That's not very helpful for me right now, but thankfully there is a workaround. So down here, there is a button to switch between different types of graphs. Right now, I'm in the edit value graph, but I can also switch to the edit speed graph. And then from here, I can select these handles to alter the speed at which this moves. So now that I've added all of the shapes and animations that I want on this, I want to compress these down into one thing in my layers menu so that I'm not working with all this clutter. To do that, I'm going to need to do something called pre-composing to these layers. And what that will do is basically add them to their own sort of mini composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all 4 of these layers by holding shift and selecting each one of them. And I'm going to press Control, Shift, and C to pre-compose a new composition from those layers. And I'll just call this notification. And what that did is it compressed my entire little animation here into one new composition, which is basically acting like a layer. If I double click it, I can then open up all the layers within. I can also do that same process by selecting all these layers again and going up to layer and going all the way down here to pre-compose. And once again, okay. Now that all that is in one composition that's basically acting as a layer, I can use just one mask to affect all of the layers within. So to create a mask, all I have to do is go up to my shape tool, and with my layer selected, I can draw a new shape in like that. And then if I scrub around, it disappears when it leaves the shape. Now I've made it a little bit too small, and I want to make this shape a little bit wider so I can get the whole image in. So I want to make it bigger, I just go to my selection tool, double click my mask shape, and then just drag it out like so. There we go. Much better. Now by default, this mask is a additive mask, so anything that's within the mask is added to the scene. But if I go down here to my layer, I can also change the mode to be a subtractive mode. So now when it's outside of the mask, it appears. And there's a couple different modes here that all modify the way the mask works. Before I finish up here, I'm just going to go back into my notification composition and adjust some of the timings on these animations because they're going a little bit slow. So to do that, I can just double click the layer, and now here are all of my old layers again. So now I can go into each of these and adjust the keyframes for my animations. All right, and then I think I want to put a little animation at the end that reverses this whole cycle. So to do that, I can just copy the keyframes over with Control C and Control V. And then over here, I'm just going to adjust the speed here. So it kind of eases into that animation more when it leaves. All right. Let's see how that looks. Pops up. Very nice. So I'm done. I can go back to my regular composition by clicking this. And I'm going to turn back on the visibility of my footage. I can come back and adjust this timing later, but for now, I am pretty happy with that. So now that that's all ready, I want the notification icon to follow her watch in space. And the way to do that is to use After Effects tracker system. There are multiple different ways to do tracking in After Effects, but this is probably the simplest way. So to access tracking, I'm going to go up to Window and go down here to Tracker. And it'll give me this window here on the right. And then from there, I'm going to select my footage layer. I'm going to hide my notification for now. And in here, this tracker menu, I'm going to select track motion. And that will give me this track point, which I can then place on a point to try and track it through space. By default, it's set to track position, but I can also set it up to track the rotation as well. And notice when I clicked rotation, it added a second point to track. So how this works is the first point tracks the position and tries to follow the point exactly. And the second point uses a relative point in the scene to track to try to determine the rotation around this first point as the anchor. So skimming through down here, rather than down here, I'm going to find the moment when the watch settles right here. That looks pretty good. With track point 1, I'm going to follow kind of this upper area of the watch and expand my inner selection to grab this part that I want to track specifically. And the outer square just kind of helps keep track of what's around it. And then with my second point, I'm going to move that to here. Make sure that this plus point is in the center of your box. And it's a bit of an odd thing to track, but I'm going to track this corner in the inside of her sleeve, because that point in her sleeve seems to be locked in pretty tightly with the rotation of the watch. So it'll give the system a good idea of how that watch is rotating. Once I'm pretty confident with where I've placed my tracking points, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to tell it to start analyzing. And it's going to go through frame by frame and do its best to track those points in space as the footage plays. Now I'm going to watch it closely and watch for it to diverge from the path. And from this point, you can see that it has diverged a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move back to where I think it kind of diverged. Looks to be starting around here. I'm just going to manually move a few of these. Remember, you can use page up and page down to scrub through frames one by one. I think I need to make this tracking point a little bit bigger. And I'm going to hit analyze again. Very good. It's going. It's going. It looks like the sleeve is getting a little bit lost in this big motion. At this point, I'm going to select these buttons to analyze frame by frame because the movement is so large. I think that's about as far as we're going to get with this. So by this point, I'm going to want to have the animation off because I can't really get it to follow very well after this point anyway, as the watch disappears. I'm just going through. That's looking pretty good. Now going to the back. I'm going to analyze backwards as well. Whoop. I'm going to undo that because I went a little far. There's a big sweep there, so I'm going to have to do some manual tracking there at some point. Right there. I'm definitely eyeballing at this point. I don't think we're going to see the animation playing here either. So this is just a matter of giving myself a little more wiggle room. There we go. All right. That's pretty good. I'm happy with that. So now that I've got all this motion tracking data, I'm going to need to apply it to something. Because right now, all that data is just sitting on my footage. So I'm going to need to make a layer that I want to retain all of the movements that were just tracked, which I will then parent my notification to. So going up to layer, I'm going to hit new, null object. And that basically means this is a empty layer. There's nothing in it. And I'm going to go ahead and rename it to targeting. After I've done that, I'm going to click on my footage layer again. And what's that? I'm not seeing my motion tracking anymore. Well, to bring it back, I need to double click the footage to look specifically at just my footage and not my composition. So you can see up here, tabs will form when I'm looking at specific assets or compositions. So for example, I could double click on my targeting layer and there's nothing really here, but I can look specifically at just that layer. Same thing with the footage. So now in my footage, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to select edit target. It gives me this pop-up. And from here, I'm going to select my targeting null layer. Hit OK. And then I'm going to hit apply. It'll give me this box. It will ask me if I want to apply it to the X or the Y or both. I'm going to leave it at both and hit OK. So now you can see this null layer is moving around with my motion tracking. From there, I'm going to bring back the visibility of my notification. And I want to parent it to my targeting layer. So I'm going to go over here to my parenting menu, select targeting. And now it's moving along with the watch. I'll need to adjust its positioning, but the tracking is working right. So now that I've got that set up, I'm going to go back and readjust the timing of this one more time because the timing is really off and it's visible for way too long. So I'm going to find the point in the time slider where I want the notification to appear. I think right here is good. I'm going to double click notification and I'm going to get to work retiming this again. All right, let's see how that looks. Going back to composition over here. Excellent. The timing is a lot better. Now let's move it into position, because this is not a good place for it. So my selection tool, I'm just going to move it up here, approximately above the watch. And I'm going to scale it down. Make sure I have the chain here to keep the aspect ratio. About there is good. So I like where it's sitting, but now I want to adjust this so that it looks more like it's in 3D space, because right now it's just very flat with the screen. So to do that, I'm going to turn this into a 3D layer. And to do that, I'm going to go over here and see in this column, if I hover over the icon of the little square or of the little cube, it says 3D layer. So I'm going to check that on. Now you may find that when you turn on your 3D layer option for your graphic, that your footage disappears and you're just left with your graphic in a blank space. To fix this, just go down to here and switch from one view to two views and then back to one view. And that should refresh your scene and bring back your footage. So now with my layer in 3D mode, I can go into transform, and you can see I now have a Z rotation as well as a Z scale and a Z position. So where Y is up and down, X is left and right, Z is forward and back in space. And that's what makes this 3D now. So now that I have a 3D layer, I can rotate these so that this appears in 3D space. It may take a little finagling to get it to look right. And I just want it to look like it's facing her in perspective. You can pull it away a little bit like that. Be careful when using the handles here, because they'll behave differently than if you just grab outside of the handles. I'm going to hit play. Nice, that's looking pretty good. I can adjust the rotation too with keyframes to make it look more accurate throughout. So I think I'm going to try and adjust the rotation for when her arm swings a little bit closer. I think from here to here. It's not much of a difference, but it's a little bit. So I'm going to hit keyframe on all my rotations. And I move forward to just this point. And just going to adjust this slightly. Say negative 33. 34. And maybe from here, rotate a little bit more this way, just kind of exasperate the turn. So now it kind of swings with her arm a little bit more. There's a little bit of jitteriness though going on in the targeting. So I'm going to open that up, and you can see that these are just all keyframes that the motion tracking is laid in. But I'm going to find some of these little pops, and I'm just going to take out those keyframes. So it swings. There's one. Just grab those, delete. Delete a couple of those. There's a pop here. Just taking out some of these keyframes will smooth out the movement. Though you want to be careful about which ones you delete. That looks a bit better. All right, next let's talk about blending modes. Blending modes work pretty much identically to the way that they work in Photoshop, where you can set a layer to act differently than just being a solid, opaque image. Instead, it will blend with the rest of your image in different ways. So to access blending modes, you can go down here to toggle switches/modes, and it'll give you these options to adjust the blending mode for your layers. So I'm going to select here, and these are all the same options as in Photoshop. So you can multiply to make it darker, or overlay, which is a little bit lighter. You can just change the hue or the saturation or the color. All these different options that the best way to find out what they do is to just play with them. Now, my goal is to make this look like a floating hologram above the watch. So I'm going to pick something like lighten or screen, perhaps. I'm just going to look through all these different options and see which one I like the best. I think screen is the winner. I'll check color dodge. I'm going to look at it, how it looks here. Screen versus color dodge. Yeah, you see more of the numbers with screen. There we go. Of course, it's good to play around with your options and see what each one does, but if you're doing something like this, it'll probably be screen that you'll end up using. To look through all these different options really quickly, you can hold shift and just press plus or minus on your keyboard to shift through all different modes to find out which one looks best. Next up, let's take a look at how we can add a special effect to this layer. So to do that, I'm going to go over here to Effects and Presets on the right. If you don't see this, you can find it in Window, Effects and Presets to add it to your right panel over here. And then there are a lot of effects and presets I can use, but I'm just going to quickly type in glow. And I'm going to grab this one under Stylize. So I'm going to click it and drag it directly onto my notification layer. And when I did that, it brought in this new effects controls window, which shares the same spot as the project window. Here I have a lot of different options for this glowing effect. Every effect is different, so they'll have different options available to you in the effects controls window. So whenever you use a new effect, it's good to just play around in that space and see what is available to you. And immediately that comes in pretty intensely. So I'm going to first, I'm just going to see what that looks like when it's really intense with a really high radius. And that's too much. Let's drop it down. Let's drop that glow intensity down to 0.5 and drop the glow radius down. And then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this effect by hitting Control D. Minimize that one. And I'll drop the intensity, increase the radius. If you're losing some of the details in your glow, you could also change the blending mode of your effect. So here my glow operation is add, but I'm going to change it to screen on both of these glow effects. And now my details are coming back in. And that'll allow me to duplicate my glow one more time. There we go. Next, let's talk about adding motion blur to this. So to do that, I'm going to go back into my notification. And right here where you'd find the 3D layer box, go over by 2, and you'll find motion blur as an option. So I'm just going to go ahead and check all of these. And then you see once I hit play, there will be some motion blur on all these movements that make it look a bit more realistic. Then going back to our composition, I can do the same thing on my notification layer, but first I need to toggle switches and modes again to bring back this. And also you'll need to make sure that motion blur is enabled for your whole composition here. Though when you press this for the first time, it will activate this, but it could be turned off. So just keep that in mind. I'm really happy with that now. So now that my effect is in a pretty good place, it's time for me to export this so that I can upload it and show it off to people. So to do that, I have a couple different methods. I'm going to go up to composition, and I could either add this to render queue, or I could add this to Adobe Media Encoder queue. I'm going to start by showing the render queue first. So the render queue is After Effects in software method of exporting videos. It doesn't need to go through any other software. It works right in After Effects, but that means you can't be working in After Effects while you're rendering. By default, it will render out a QuickTime video, but there's all different options for JPEG sequences or MP3 or WAV files, as well as other options here for resizing or cropping or other options to modify your render, which we won't really be touching today. And then over here, you click Output to, and you can decide a folder for your file to export to, as well as give it a name. And hit cancel on that. And if you go over here and hit render, it will go through and render out your whole clip and then export it to the folder that you specified. The other method of exporting your footage is to go to composition, add to Adobe Media Encoder queue. So Adobe Media Encoder is a separate piece of software which you can download from the Creative Cloud, and it should be involved in the same plan as After Effects if you have that. And Adobe Media Encoder is built specifically for exporting your video files to specific platforms. So for example, it's for building for the web, or for building for certain theater setups, or any sort of specific hardware you can think of. So Adobe Media Encoder queue looks like this. When you press that button, it will launch this automatically. So over here is the output file. If you click this, you can select what folder it's going to export to and give it a name. To the left is the preset, and you can select a new preset over here in the bottom left. There are many different presets to choose from. So if you have really specific needs, you can search through here and find what you need. Down here at the bottom, you'll find web video. And there's a lot of options for things like Twitter, Vimeo, YouTube. Oftentimes, if you are uploading this to the internet, it's best to pick from one of these, because these will have the appropriate compression to upload these somewhere without it being a massive file. For example, if I wanted to apply the Twitter preset, I could grab it and drag it onto my composition, and now it'll export for Twitter. But I'm not going to use Twitter because the Twitter one is a bit aggressive in its compression. I'm going to use the YouTube 1080p. And once I'm ready, I'm going to hit Start Queue. And so it's rendering out. It shouldn't take very long because it's not a very long clip. And then once it's done, again, here's my video, and here's the full clip. So thank you for sticking through this video. I know it was a long one and there's a lot covered. I hope this was helpful in setting you up for your future endeavors with After Effects, and I hope you have a good day. See you in the next one.